Hi, this is Dora DeLellis with ThoughtsOnTheMoney.com, where I discuss money issues and offer practical money management tips. Today's topic is debt, and I also promise to present some pieces of information from my personal collection of articles that led up to the Great Recession. I saved these pieces from 10 years ago because that situation was so impactful to me that I wanted to create my own chronology of events. Today's pieces revolve around events that occurred at Bear Stearns. And let me preface my interest. I started with Bear Stearns in 1988 and spent over 10 years of my career there. In 1988, the company had just transitioned from a partnership to a corporation. I left in 2006, so there was a gap in between. I remained friendly with my coworkers. However, 2006 was well before the detrimental events occurred. So I'm going to pause here, let you take a look at the 4 images, and I'll be back to give you some background information on each. Image number 1 is a timeline of the company. I apologize, it's a little fuzzy and cut off in the beginning. The company began their operations in 1923 with a $500,000 capital infusion when they started their brokerage activity. The timeline ends in 2007, and what occurred in 2007 was the bankruptcy of 2 Bear Stearns hedge funds that were heavily involved in the subprime mortgage market. They were heavily exposed to risk and debt, and that's what led to the demise of the company. Image number 2 is a New York Times front page article dated March 15, 2008, delivering the shocking news that J.P. Morgan was to acquire Bear Stearns at a $2 per share valuation. This led to someone taping a $2 bill to the outside of the 40-story tower at 383 Madison Avenue in New York City. Therefore, all of the service lines of the business, including the building, which was built and owned by Bear Stearns, that building was not leased, was being offered off and acquired by J.P. Morgan at $2 a share, which was shocking. Image number 3 is a screenshot also taken on March 15, 2008, showing the company's decrease in stock price at 90% in one day. Had I collected other screenshots from previous days, you would have seen drastic decreases just as well. And this is from a company whose whose share price of stock was $170 a share just 1 year prior. Image number 4 is a Business Week article dated March 31st. And you can see that from the subheadline that the fear was starting to develop that if this occurred at Bear Stearns, that it was going to affect the other large banks, and that's inevitably what happened. So these events occurred from a huge steaming pile of debt and risk. So I'm going to integrate that into the rest of my discussion, and I want to discuss some other pieces of information I've looked at recently. I recently read an article in the quarterly Charles Schwab magazine that they distribute to their stock account holders, and they had one article in there that pointed to a simplified list of elements to look for if you're researching a stock investment. And instead of reading all of Warren Buffett's books and even books written by writers that study Warren Buffett's theory, you may drown in some of the metrics and get confused by the math. He's very detailed. This article really simplified it. So I want to point to the most critical elements. And the first one that they talk about is, of course, researching an industry that has growth potential and strong cash flow. But the most important elements following that was looking at the level of debt and the amount of risk that the company is exposed to. Any good management will monitor those 2 elements because too high levels of debt and a high amount of risk could expose the company to the risk of bankruptcy in the event of increased competition or any other detrimental economic event that's outside their control. And they're looking to protect the company, and they can do that very easily by managing the levels of debt. So it's not just the amount of personal debt that you take on, but when you're choosing a stock investment, looking at levels of debt is critical as well. So I want to move on to a book that I just recently read and integrate that into how your levels of debt can protect you from outside detrimental events occurring in the economic environment. And the book is called Squeezed, and it was just recently released by Alyssa Court. And I'm not disputing any of the examples that she points to in the book. However, they're really not new to this year or this decade or this lifetime. These events have been going on back way back in history. And I'm going to mention some of those examples to interject and indicate how you can protect yourself and become adaptable to situations that you may experience, as this author has described. And one of the first examples that she points to is the student loan crisis in this country. And there's no doubt that there's a student loan crisis. Every time I read what the outstanding student loan debt is in this country, it starts at $1 trillion, and then I've read it's $1.3 trillion, and then I've read as high as $1.5 trillion. That's the most recent I've read. That's amazing that that's the amount of outstanding student debt. And what the author writes about is that these people have been sold on the promise that if they purchase this very expensive education and take out those loans, that they have a guarantee of a lucrative career that will pay them a salary, that they'll be able to pay off the debt and live a very comfortable middle-class lifestyle. But what's happening in reality is these people are graduating with this large amount of debt, and they're either unemployed or underemployed. So obviously, if they're unemployed, they have no chance of paying down their debt, and they keep extending it and delaying the onset of the payback of the loan. But when someone is underemployed, they're working in their field, but they're working at such a low level and earning low wages such that they're struggling to pay back the loan, and they're delaying their typical middle-class lifestyle attainment, where they're not able to buy a home and start a family and start accumulating assets. So they're struggling to pay off their debt, and they're struggling to work in their field, in the field that they worked so hard and to earn their education with. So I have no doubt that that's happening. But I want to point to a historical example that I know of firsthand. But before I get to that, I want to mention some of the other points that the author makes. And she speaks about pregnancy discrimination, age discrimination. Of course, none of that is new. People that are moonlighting to maintain their middle-class status, that's nothing new as well. And then she goes on to speak of how technology is stealing jobs. With artificial intelligence and robots, there's been a downsizing in the employment, and basically employees are just not as much in demand. And technology has really been increasing at a very rapid rate since the late 80s, and especially in the early 90s. Once everyone had a personal computer available to them, that's when I noticed that the world started moving a lot faster. And technology did very rapidly take over a lot of positions. So I want to point to some historical examples that we can contrast with the examples that this author has mentioned. And I want to note that none of this is new, and how you would be able to adapt to these situations, because they are occurring right now and they will be occurring in the future. So the first example I want to speak to is something that I learned of when I was in high school. I had a high school teacher that mentioned that his grandfather was an iceman. And an iceman delivered giant blocks of ice to homeowners that used an ice box. So before people had refrigerators, they used what's called an ice box, and it required a large block of ice to be delivered every day, and that's how they kept their food cold. But when the refrigerator became a consumer product and a household staple, the iceman was basically out of a career. Okay, same thing with the buggy whips. with a buggy whip manufacturer, when people were cruising around by horse and buggy, they needed a buggy whip. Well, when automobiles were created and sold to the middle-class consumer, the buggy whips were no longer needed because no one was riding around by horse and buggy anymore. So that's another example of a product that loses its consumer base. Okay, moving on to the 1970s. I can remember my mother having a conversation with a neighbor about how the middle class was being squeezed. And the neighbor agreed with my mom that the rich people had everything they needed and they didn't suffer any harmful lifestyle effects from any increases in prices or increases in taxes. Of course, the poor people were on welfare, so they didn't suffer either. They weren't losing out either. However, the middle class was absorbing all of the increases in taxes, in prices, in price increases that were passed along to the consumer, and any other outside price increase had to be absorbed. It got stuck with the middle class, and there was more and more taken from the middle class. Starting to sound familiar? And that was in the 1970s. So I have another example from the 1970s. A former coworker of mine had told me that he received his MBA in the early 1970s. And in the early 1970s, there was a very drastic stock market crash that scared away a lot of investors and left for a very poor financial atmosphere. So the economy was not doing well. At the time that he earned his MBA, he could not get a job in his field. But he was a young family man, and he had children to support. So until he was able to get a job in his field, he took a job as a janitor of a college and basically scrubbed toilets to support his family until he was able to get a job in his field at a wage that was commensurate with his education. So that's an example of underemployment that occurred back in the 70s. I also want to have another show and tell item here of another example. And if you're listening, what I'm holding up is a brown translucent strip, and on the edge it says Kodak. And it's a piece of camera film. It's negative from a piece of camera film. And this is how people took images before we started using the smartphone. And Kodak was the major player in this field, where they not only made money by selling cameras, but they made money from the sale of films and from the film processing. So what you had to do back then was go out and buy a film cartridge, load it into the camera, take the photos, take the camera film out, drop it off at the photo store or at the photomat, if you can remember what that is, and wait a week and then go back and pick up your prints of your images. Okay? What we do now is a far cry from that. And one of the executives from Kodak, when digital imaging was patented, which was back in 1975, which I did not know it was that early. I was very surprised by that fact. But he went to the Kodak executives and wanted to move the business into the digital imaging market. And he was shot down by the executives. They did not want to interrupt their business model, and they were on the gravy train. That the company had 14,000 global employees based out of the headquarters in a huge building in Syracuse, New York. So this executive took his idea to Apple, and Apple created the first consumer-marketed digital imaging camera, which eventually got integrated into the smartphones that we use today. But when that happened, Kodak basically lost their consumer base. Everyone stopped buying camera film because people started buying digital cameras. So there's an example there of just as recent as the 90s of a company losing its market base, losing its consumer, and losing its revenue. So the company eventually declared bankruptcy in 2012, which I was really surprised it was as late as that, because they had endeared themselves to the middle-class consumer for all those years with a slogan by the name of "It's a Kodak moment." and they wanted to entice people to create memories, and that's really how they appealed to the consumer market. And it dawned on me when I was just watching a documentary on this called Inside the Storm, where they interviewed that executive, that slogan is long gone. No one uses the term anymore. It's just forgotten. But there's that's a perfect example of a company losing their customer base, all those people losing their jobs, and that executive mentioned how there was so much pain and suffering of these people that lost their careers. So this has happened, not long ago. It's happening now, and it will happen in the future. But the reason why I point out these examples of what's mentioned in the book and what's happened in history is that by maintaining a low level of debt and living below your means will allow you to become adaptable to these situations and maintain resiliency so that you can ride the storm of picking up the pieces and having to move on to another career or other employment if you have to, and not have to take a drastic cut, or even if you have to take a drastic cut in wages, you will not suffer bankruptcy or foreclosure, and you won't have the stranglehold of a large amount of debt, which is very scary if the economic environment changes. So the question I leave you with today is, how are you managing your debt, or is your debt managing you? So join me next time when I speak about becoming the CEO of your life and envisioning your financial future. Please leave feedback and comments on thoughtsonthemoney.com, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.